all of them became hits because they were great, but the others were phenomenal. And Two Gunslingers is so brilliant because it's funny, yet it's serious at the same time, and it's propulsive music. And it's about two gunslingers in the Old West whose job is to go out and have duels, which is not a job you can do too long, you know. It's not that you can sustain. And they're in the song questioning their existence, you know, and then realizing, you know, it's an existential, funny song about that takes place in the Old West with rock and roll. Perfect, you know, perfect song. Who would do that well except Tom Petty and make it seem so real? And they're saying, I'm taking control of my life now. You know, we don't have to kill each other right now. And it's really a song about nonviolence and maybe considering peace. You know, that we don't have to keep killing each other. We could do something else. But Tom is not going to come out and just say, consider peace. You know, he wants to do it in a way that's fun and interesting, and he's taking care of you guys. So he loved that I brought up that song. He showed me a poster that his friend, I think it was Jim Lanahan, sent him of an old Western movie that inspired it. But he also really loved that I learned the songs and that I was a songwriter, and I understood that because so much of his genius was there, but these guys rarely get to discuss music, I mean the actual mechanics of music, because most people writing about music aren't musicians. And so they write about words often, or the show, or they talk about sports or something else, you know, but so rarely do they get to talk about music. And some people, like Brian Wilson, the guys in Steely Dan, that's where they live completely. And Tom lived in the world more than a lot of rock stars. He was in the real world often, not all the time. But when he realized I could learn the songs, he really liked that. So after we did our first interview on Wildflowers, first two interviews, I interviewed him a few times after that, and we always had a great talk and had fun. And so I had this idea that it would be just great to do a whole book with him. But the reason he liked talking to me was I was never asking about his personal life. That was always kind of my promise to any songwriter. We'll just talk about the music, your songwriting, creative process, no personal life stuff. And that appealed to most people because they don't necessarily want to answer those questions. It's certainly Tom. So that was the idea of the book. And so I said it to him just at the same time Omnibus, the publisher, was saying, you need a book. There hadn't been a book about Tom Petty yet. At that time, there'd been, I think, 12 books on Madonna. Not one on Tom Petty. This is the business I'm in right there. That shows you a lot. But, I mean, Madonna had a huge impact. I'm not taking that away, but Tom. You know, there's a lot of musicians, some great stars and some others who are what we call critics' favorites. You know, where the critics say, this matters, and they keep saying that. And then there's the others that the people know, that matters more than anything, and that doesn't stop. And that's who Tom was. A lot of the critics never quite got him. They always put him in the shadow of Dylan and the Beatles or the Byrds, as if he was trying to be something other than he was, because some of his music had those sounds, and he was influenced by those, of course. But he was Tom Petty, and I know they felt, some of them, that the music came easy to him and that he wasn't important. But coming after a few decades, when it just kept expanding, I think they all should have caught on. And this is a true story. When American Treasure came out, I went to a wonderful party in LA for him. That was sad because he wasn't there, but the guys from the band were there, and Dana, and Mary Clouser, and Tony, his managers, and also a lot of the DJs in town, and all the critics I know. And one critic I've gotten to know really well, I won't name him by name, he's a friend of mine, but he said to me, he plays these critic games, like, who do you think of rock stars will be important 50 years from now? Now, number one, 50 years isn't that far anymore. It's been 50 years since Abbey Road. I mean, it's not like we're in a whole different world. 50 years before I was born, you know, was ragtime, you know, or like pre-ragtime. It was like 1908. That was a different world, but rock and roll has been here for decades. And, you know, when Elvis started, those guys all just assumed this is a fad and it'll go soon, we'll be gone. It's still with us, thank God, and we're still here, and it still means a lot to us. But this guy's critics said, who do you think will be important? And I said, Tom Petty. Really? You think so? Why? He's one of the greatest songwriters of our time, and his fan base is expanding every day. And there's so many people that they say, you know, I always loved him, I was going to be great, but since we left him, I've listened to so much else, and oh my God! You know, and everyone's just in awe of how much he did, and all those tracks that he didn't even put on albums that are great, and the new stuff that comes out. And so I see it's been expanding, and the love for Tom is just so poignant and beautiful. But critics still can't admit it. So he goes, okay, Paul, tell me, what song of Tom's will anyone remember 50 years from now? So I just mentioned Free Fall. Because really, not a good song. Okay, I don't have to go on. You get that. Or another DJ, a well-known DJ in LA told me, you know what? I never played him once in all those years. Well, I think that was a mistake. I guess he couldn't find one good Tom song that was good for radio, you know. It was on a hip radio station. I think he probably heard that, those other stations, they play them all the time, so we gotta not do that. But Tom loved that his stuff was for everybody. And he said many times that, old folks love my song, because those are a lot of my fans, and, their friends. But kids do too. And he says, I love when a kid comes up to me and likes one of my songs, because kids don't lie. And that meant a lot to him. And when MTV came out, suddenly they were TV stars in a way most rock bands had never been. And the Beatles made movies, so people knew them, but not many others. But suddenly Tom and the guys, they were on TV all the time, on MTV 24 hours a day. And he said that changed everything. Because no matter where we were, everyone knew us. The old lady came up, and then her mother would come up. She knew us too, So that changed everything, and he became an artist for the people. And I really think of him. I know those critics want to link him to Dylan and Harrison. They were two of his closest friends. But to me, he was always more like Hank Williams or Woody Guthrie, who were writing songs for the people. And they wrote great songs. They were crafty songwriters. They wrote great melodies. They had songcraft down. But they weren't trying to write hits. They were trying to write songs that meant something to people. And Woody Guthrie said, the worst thing that can happen is to cut yourself loose from the people. And the best thing is to sort of vaccinate yourself right into the big streams and blood of the people. That's what Tom did. Tom was always caring about the people and wanting to write songs that people would like. He was writing songs that expressed him. It was his art, it was his expression, but it was to reach other people. It wasn't to impress people, it was to reach people and to express himself. He was just an expressive person. I mean, you knew that if you go to a show and there's 50,000 of you out there, or us out there, bigger than many small towns, and he's touching everyone in their heart, and they're singing along, and they're all united by one song. And it's such a delicate thing, it's words and music, but it came from his heart and his spirit. There's a friend calling me right now, I just thought they were going, enough, I'll wrap it up. I'm worried about that. Tom worried about that stuff too. He worried about stuff, even if it didn't matter. But he had a lot of folk wisdom about songwriting, like I was saying earlier. He would talk to people, and he knew which wisdom to accept and which ones not to accept, which bits of wisdom not to accept. For example, Roy Orbison said something to him, which other people have said to me. Mose Allison said too about songwriting, that if you got an idea that's good enough, don't worry about recording it. If it's good enough, you'll remember it. Not true. Especially it might be certainly for Roy Orbison or Mose Allison, who were geniuses, but generally when you're writing a lot of songs, like Tom was writing melodies, sometimes you get a melody, who knows where that came from? It could be the same chords, it could be one chord, you're playing a C major chord, and suddenly you got a whole other melody. As Tom said, sometimes you pick up the guitar and he said, sometimes it just feels friendly, other days no. And if you don't capture those melodies immediately, at least my mind will start to normalize the thing, like everything else I've done, and you're trying to make it a little different. So he felt too that's very important to tape, especially music. But then there were other bits of wisdom that he learned, and he said, this is a good thing for songwriters to understand, because he said so many times a guy will come up to me and say, Tom, you have got to hear my new song. I have just made this chord progression that you have never heard before. There's a chord in there that I don't think anyone's ever used before in a chord progression. Wait till you hear this. And Tom would listen, often patiently, maybe not always, and go, you know what? You know why you've never heard that chord before in the song? That doesn't sound good at all. Take that chord out. In other words, you're not writing songs like a lot of us started or still did to impress other guitarists or other songwriters. Like, wow, a triple diminished right in G major and then goes to the F minor. Never would have thought of that. If it doesn't propel the melody and if it doesn't sound good and seamless, Tom would take that out, And yet he would find those unusual progressions that just sounded great and soulful and visceral. But that almost seems like an obvious thing. And he said that happened a lot. He thought a lot of people, he said, for example, he thought Hendrix, this is one of the greatest guitarists of all time, was also a tremendous songwriter, a real inventive, amazing musician, melodist, but also a remarkable songwriter. But that's very unusual to have a songwriter who's that great on the instrument. Generally, they're great songwriters like Tom, and they got a Mike Campbell, or Springsteen has, Stephen or Nils Lofgren, or both of them at the same time now. And, Clarence too, Clarence's nephew. But, so he said for that reason, some guitarists that came up really became, great guitarists and spent all their time learning, how to play lead guitar. Didn't spend a lot of time on the artistry of songwriting. So he said, I thought their songwriting suffered because it was all about guitar. And it was a good showcase for guitar, but are those great songs? And so he understood that it wasn't about the guitar part, it wasn't about the chords, it was about the whole thing, the totality of it, which is kind of an obvious lesson. But Tom, he understood those things, and I think that's one reason he had such longevity, that he understood those basic things, and he never let go of that. It was interesting when we started the book. The idea, as I said, was to be just conversations about music. That was the idea, but it became very quickly apparent that all his music was about his life, and all his life was about his music. So it really was impossible for him to start to discuss music without discussing his life. And he embraced it. So we kind of said, we can talk about both. And there are a few, stories that I'd heard about it, and I wanted just to know if they were true. I did my research, and one of the most notorious ones was that the reason the Pettys were in Florida, here in this town, Gainesville, was because his grandfather, Pulpwood Petty, killed a guy in Georgia and had to get here, so he wasn't killed there. And so I asked him, I just assumed that was one of those stories that you might find on Wikipedia, but no truth to that. And Tom said, actually, that is the story my dad told me. Didn't tell me until later in life that was true. He said, my grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. My grandfather was a white guy. She was a cook in a logging camp, and he worked there. And they made timber into pulpwood. And he married my grandmother, which was not popular to mix the races, to put it lightly. And so they were in some danger, so fearing they might get hurt, his grandfather stole a horse and wagon. It's like a story out of the Great West. It literally is. Or the Great South, I should say. Stole a horse and wagon in the middle of the night, suddenly stopped on the road by several guys, and as Tom put it, some kind of violent situation came down about him being with an Indian. Someone got insulted, and my grandfather ended up killing the guy. And, if not for that, the history of rock and roll would have been entirely different. That was a fortunate murder for rock and roll. We get Tom here to Florida. Also, I heard stories about his father, and, a lot of the great songwriters, John Lennon, McCartney, Springsteen, James Taylor, had a real hard time with their fathers. Paul Simon just wanted a little approval. Like, what I did, not bad, and they needed that. Again, I think it drove a lot of them to prove something. I'm going to show him. And Tom's dad was a tough guy. Tom said he was kind of wild. He said he was always driving into ditches. He said, I thought everyone's father drove into ditches all the time. I didn't know that was unusual. And Tom was a tender, emotional guy who loved music more than anything. He was romantic. He had a genius for memorizing things. He could memorize nursery rhymes when he was 4 or 5 immediately. And so when he discovered Elvis and got all those 45s and all the great records that he heard on radio, he could learn them immediately. He absorbed them like a sponge. But he was a very emotional kid, and his dad liked to go out hunting and shooting things and would insist that Tom go along. And Tom said it was kind of mandatory, but I never liked it. Tom hated hunting, shooting, hated being on the fishing boat with his dad too long. He said my dad was a hard man, hard to be around. He was hard on me. He wanted me to be a lot more macho than I actually was. I was this tender kid, more inclined to the arts than, shooting something. And this is a story, no one I know my whole life has ever told me a story that even resembles this one. It seems like a story, but it was Tom Petty telling me this story, and I know it's true. He said once he was out fishing with his dad, and again, I grew up in Chicago, this never happened, but to him, and being here in Florida, you guys might know, an alligator came up. I've never had a gator experience, especially during my childhood. It would have terrified me. So the alligator comes up, and his dad, not scared at all, this is how Tom says, I actually saw my dad take his forefinger and thumb and punch the eyes in on the alligator to show me that he could knock the alligator out. And then Tom, as if to affirm it, he said it over again. He was nuts. He said, he took his thumb and forefinger and pushed the alligator's eyes in. He repeated it twice. And he goes, my daddy wasn't afraid of anything. Another time I once saw him grab a rattlesnake by the tail, swing it around his head, and pop his neck. That's pretty wild shit, Yeah. My dad was excellent at ping pong, but no rattlesnake. But his dad also, and he said that a lot, his dad was tough, but his dad had pride in him. And his dad bought him his first guitar, a Stella acoustic, and Tom got 2 lessons, and with only 2 lessons, he was on his way. Like a lot of great songwriters, as soon as he had a few chords, he started writing songs. It didn't take long. He didn't have to learn to be Hendrix first. His first song ever written when he was 12 was called Baby, I'm Leaving. It had 4 chords. He told me it had a C and F, and he said F, as we all know, was the hardest chord to learn, but you gotta learn it, and he did. A G, 3 major chords, and an A minor. And he was crafty from the start. He was proud that there's an A minor in there. Right away he knew that'll be cool. And we know the story. He got to go see Elvis when Elvis was in Ocala. And the truth is, he didn't know much about Elvis. He told me he was just laying in the straw one day, and his aunt said, "You want to go see Elvis?" And he said, "I just knew he was this guy that wiggled." He wasn't an Elvis guy yet. And he went there, and Elvis comes out. He's like wondering if I'll recognize him. And suddenly this guy comes out glowing, like Jesus, and that radiance. He said it was radiant, and all the girls, there probably were guys there, but all the girls just went crazy, just went nuts. And that appealed to Tom. And Tom said, "I want that job." But in truth, he never thought of himself being a solo artist like Elvis, because it was another galvanizing experience. 1964, the Beatles. You heard about this band, the Beatles? Came to America, went on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that was a big deal, because all of America wanted to see it. It was a phenomenon. It changed so many people's lives. In fact, one of the last interviews I did with Tom years after the book was out was for the 50th anniversary of when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. And he did a little interview with me for Grammy.com, which I didn't think he would do, but he said, "Yeah, do it because it's you." Because he was a nice guy like that. He was always really loyal to friends and people he liked, and he was generous. And he talked about the Beatles. They made such an impact that was seeing that he could do that thing like Elvis, but with friends, but with really cool friends who looked like they were on top of the world and singing harmony and playing rock and roll. It really appealed to him. They were playing rock and roll, but that harmony, that camaraderie and the friendship, and these 4 guys doing it as a unit and doing it all, that really spoke to him. So from the beginning, that was his vision, not to be Elvis, but to be the Beatles. And but as you might notice, he wasn't the Heartbreakers, because he learned early on that you got to keep the Tom Petty name out there. He was a pure guy, and he had a good heart. But he also understood this is a business, it's an industry. And to be an artist in an industry is not easy, so he made it Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, just in case it fell apart. People would remember that name, and they did. That worked out. But before that, as you might know, his first band was the Sundowners, which he formed in school when a pretty girl named Cindy Crawford came up to him. Not the model Cindy Crawford, but a girl here in Gainesville, and friends here have confirmed that was her name. She said, "You have a band? Can you play at our thing?" And he lied and said yes. And then he got his friends together, and they had 3 guitars, sax and drums, all plugged into one Silvertone amp. They learned 4 instrumentals, and he said the first time they played together was the biggest rush of my life. He never stopped. They went to the party, they played their 4 songs. It was so great, and they loved it. They asked him if they could play more, and they played those same 4 songs again. Later, he learned more songs. He learned you don't have to repeat anything. But from then on, there was nothing that was going to stop him. That's all he wanted. And he knew he had to leave his hometown. And, leaving Gainesville was important to him, but obviously who he was that Gainesville kid. And so many times stuff he said reflected that Gainesville kid. So many times he said, "Gee, I wouldn't have thought when I was a kid in Gainesville that I'd be doing that." And a lot of famous people had to leave their hometowns to really make it. The Beatles left Liverpool. Jesus, as you might know, had to leave his hometown. It's not uncommon, and Tom understood that. So he went to Hollywood, where I've lived for a long time. My son was born in Hollywood, but turned out pretty well anyway. But a lot of people come to Hollywood, like I did, and thinking, well, it's just going to be shimmer and stardust and stars everywhere and limos. And then you see this industry town and go, this is Hollywood. A lot of people are dismayed, and a lot worse than dismayed. And wow, there's a lot of it is not great. It's the underbelly as well as the shimmer. Tom didn't feel that way, even though they put him up, as we said, a hooker's motel, the Hollywood premier, east of Western. You never want to go east of Western, anywhere in Los Angeles, you don't have to. But he loved it. I said, were you dismayed by Hollywood? He goes, no, not at all. I loved it. Really. Because all I saw were record companies everywhere. There's Capitol, there's the Stones label, everywhere he saw, Warner Brothers, and that's what he was there for. And they, first with Mudcrutch and then what became the Heartbreakers, they'd already recorded some good songs and had demos. So Tom came to Hollywood with just pure determination. Nothing is going to stop me. I'm going to get this job because this is the best job I can do, and I know how to do it. I'm going to get this job and make records. And he just came in a way, I haven't heard hardly any other people, maybe the Beatles, just came with such determination and such completion already, realization already of the dream before it was realized that no one could stop him. But he did things no one else could do, because normally when you come to Hollywood, you're supposed to play the game and get your tape to someone with an attorney and go through the channels. Tom didn't do that. He goes right to Ben Frank's diner on Sunset Boulevard and to a phone book. And he started looking up record companies. And he actually found a list of all the record companies and started calling them. You don't do this normally. He said, hi, I'm Tom Petty, I'm in town. I got a tape, can I bring it over? And many people said, yeah, bring it over. And it worked right away. There were offers. But that's